Imagine standing on the deck of the Titanic. It's just after midnight. The air is bitterly cold. People are beginning to panic. Some are praying. Others still believe the ship is too grand to sink. Within the next few hours, more than 1,500 people will lose their lives. The freezing Atlantic Ocean is so cold that most people who enter it will not survive. Yet one man would spend an astonishing amount of time in those icy waters and live to tell the tale. He wasn't the captain. He wasn't a wealthy first-class passenger. And he wasn't a famous explorer or a naval officer. He was the baker. Hi, I'm Devora, and welcome to my brand new channel, Unbelievable True Stories. If you are fascinated by real stories like I am, that sound too unbelievable to be true, then you're in the right place. Every week, we'll uncover incredible moments from history. Stories of survival, courage, mystery, and ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary situations. I couldn't think of a better story to begin this journey than one of the most unbelievable survivor stories ever recorded. So let's dive in. Our story begins on April 10th, 1912. Crowds gathered at the docks in Southampton in England to witness something the world had never seen before. The RMS Titanic. At over 880 feet long, she was the largest passenger ship ever built. People called her a miracle of modern engineering. She had luxurious dining rooms, elegant staircases, a swimming pool, Turkish baths, electric elevators, and every comfort imaginable. Many people said she wasn't just a ship, she was a symbol of human achievement. Thousands of people boarded her with dreams of a new beginning. A lot of passengers who were in the first class were amongst the richest people on earth. There were immigrants also that were leaving everything behind in search of a better life in America. More than 2,200 passengers and crew stepped aboard, never imagining that only days later the Titanic's name would become one of the most famous in history. Among the crew was a quiet, hard-working man named Charles Joughin. Born in England in 1878, Charles had spent most of his life at sea. A seaman at heart, Charles had the amazing opportunity to become the Titanic's chief baker. Charles supervised a team of 13 bakers. Every single day, they worked long hours preparing fresh bread, pastries, cakes, biscuits, and desserts for everyone on board. Were one of the richest passengers on the ship or a crew member working below deck, chances are you had food prepared under Charles' supervision. He was respected by all of his crew. He was experienced and reliable, and known for staying calm under pressure. No one, not even Charles himself, could have imagined that history would remember him not for the bread he baked, but for what he did that fateful night in April. At first, the voyage was almost perfect. Passengers enjoyed beautiful dinners, children played on deck, musicians entertained guests each evening. The sea was calm. The weather was beautiful. It seemed like nothing could possibly go wrong. But nature had other plans. As the Titanic sailed across the North Atlantic, radio operators began receiving warnings from other ships. Several vessels reported dangerous ice fields directly ahead. Icebergs had drifted further south than usual. Those warnings were passed to the bridge. Some were acknowledged, others were set aside as the Titanic continued at nearly full speed. It was a calm night, too calm, in fact. Normally, waves crashing against the base of an iceberg made them easier to spot. But on this night, the ocean looked almost like glass. The moon offered very little light. The lookouts relied almost entirely on their own eyesight. And because of a shortage of equipment, they didn't even have binoculars. None of the passengers knew any of this. Most had gone to bed. Some were relaxing and chatting in the lounges. Some were enjoying one last drink before turning in. Charles had finished another long day in the bakery. Finally, he was off duty. Like many of the crew, he finally had a chance to rest. At exactly 11:40 p.m., everything changed. There wasn't a violent crash. Many passengers recorded feeling only a gentle shudder, and some didn't even realize the ship had been struck. Below the surface, an enormous iceberg had scraped along the starboard side of the Titanic. It tore open several sections of the ship's hull. Seawater rushed inside. Within minutes, engineers inspecting the damage realized the terrible truth. The Titanic could stay afloat if 4 of her watertight compartments flooded. But in this case, 6 were already filling with water. The officers on the bridge quickly understood something the passengers didn't. The Titanic wasn't going to make it. She was going to sink. And for Charles, the longest night of his life was just beginning. The officers wasted no time. Orders were given to uncover the lifeboats. Crew members rushed to their assigned stations. But despite the urgency among the officers, many passengers still had no idea just how serious the situation was. Some were even laughing. Some complained about having to leave the warmth of the ship in the middle of the night. Others stood on the deck, simply watching, convinced this was nothing more than a precaution. After all, this was the Titanic, the largest and the most luxurious ship ever built. Surely it couldn't really sink. Charles didn't have time to wonder. He had work to do. As chief baker, he immediately gathered the 13 bakers under his supervision. He gave each of them a simple but a very important task. Take fresh bread to the lifeboats. Each man carried several large loaves. It may seem like an unusual priority while a ship is sinking, but Charles understood something many people didn't. If those lifeboats made it through the night, the people inside would still need food. Even in the middle of the unimaginable chaos, he was thinking ahead. He was thinking about other people. Once the bread had been delivered, Charles made his way to the boat deck. The scene before him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Crew members shouting instructions, passengers stood wrapped in blankets, confused and frightened. Parents clutched to their children tightly, and some people were crying. Others simply stared into the darkness, unable to believe what was happening. The officers began loading the lifeboats. Women and children first. The order echoed across the deck again and again. Charles moved quickly from boat to boat, helping women and children climb safely inside. Some were too frightened to move. Others refused altogether. Imagine being asked to step off a brightly lit luxury liner into a small wooden boat, dangling more than 60 feet above a freezing black ocean. Many passengers honestly believed they were safer staying on the Titanic. Charles gently encouraged passengers onto the boat. According to testimony given later, he even helped lift reluctant passengers aboard. He wasn't thinking about himself. He was simply helping wherever he could. Ironically, Charles had actually been assigned to command lifeboat number 10. And under normal circumstances, he would have climbed aboard with the passengers. But by the time the boat was ready to leave, enough experienced crew members were already inside. So Charles stayed behind. He watched as the lifeboat disappeared into the darkness below. He had just given away what may have been his own chance of survival. One by one, the remaining lifeboats were lowered into the icy Atlantic. Charles knew there was little he could do now. He briefly returned to his cabin. There, he poured himself what he later described during the official inquiry as a drop of liquor. That single sentence would become one of the most famous parts of his story. For decades, people claimed that alcohol saved his life. It's a story you may have even heard before, but history is often more complicated than the headlines. Charles did say he had been drinking. However, modern medical experts generally agree that alcohol actually increases heat loss from the body, making hypothermia more likely, not less. So while the whiskey became part of the legend, it almost certainly wasn't the reason he survived. Leaving his cabin once again, Charles noticed dozens of wooden deck chairs scattered across the deck. One after another, he picked them up and threw them overboard, again and again and again. He knew that within minutes, hundreds of people might be fighting for their lives in the freezing ocean. Those floating chairs could give someone something to hold on to. Maybe they would only buy them a few extra minutes, or just maybe save a life. As time passed, the bow of the Titanic slipped deeper beneath the water. The angle of the deck became steeper. Passengers struggled to keep their balance. Loose furniture slid across the deck, and china crashed to the floor inside the dining rooms. Somewhere deep below, engineers continued feeding coal into the boilers to keep the lights from going off. They knew they would almost certainly die, yet they stayed at their posts so everyone else would have light just a little longer. It was one of the greatest acts of bravery that night. Suddenly, the Titanic was plunged into complete darkness, and the only sounds were the groaning of steel, the rush of freezing seawater, and the cries of people desperately searching for loved ones. Charles looked towards the stern. It was rising higher into the night sky with every passing second. He knew there was nowhere else to go. So he began climbing towards the very back of the ship, towards the highest point still above the water. Around him, dozens of others had the very same idea. Every step became more difficult as the deck tilted beneath their feet. People grabbed railings, some slipped, others helped complete strangers climb higher. And finally, Charles reached the stern rail. He climbed over it and stood on the outside, gripping it tightly with both hands. Below him stretched nothing but the dark, freezing Atlantic Ocean. There was no lifeboats nearby, no rescue in sight, only darkness. The Titanic made her final plunge, and then she was gone. In just a few moments, the largest passenger ship in the world had disappeared beneath the surface of the Atlantic. Charles later described those final seconds in a way that has fascinated historians ever since. He said it felt as though he simply rode the stern down like an elevator, instead of being thrown violently into the sea. He remained on the outside of the ship as it slipped beneath the water. When the stern finally disappeared, Charles entered the freezing waters. He later recalled that his head barely went under. But what happened next is even harder to believe. The water was around -2 degrees Celsius, around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to trigger what we now know as cold shock. When a person suddenly enters water that cold, the body reacts instantly. Breathing can become rapid and difficult to control. Muscles begin to weaken. Even strong swimmers can lose the ability to stay afloat. For many people in the water that night, survival lasted only minutes. Charles knew he couldn't panic. He had to stay calm. He had to keep moving. All around him were hundreds of other people struggling in the darkness. Some were desperately trying to swim, and some were clinging to floating wreckage. Others were calling out for help. Survivors later spoke about the sound that filled the night. Hundreds of voices crying, praying, calling for family members. It was a sound they said they would never forget. And then slowly, those voices began to fade, one by one. The freezing water was taking its toll. But Charles, he was still alive. He continued treading water. He searched the darkness for anything that might float. Eventually, he spotted something. It was the collapsible lifeboat B. Earlier that night, it had floated free as the Titanic sank, but it had overturned. And now a group of survivors were balancing on top of the upside-down boat, desperately trying to keep it from rolling over. Among them was the second officer, Charles Lightoller. Charles swam towards the boat. There was no room left for another person to climb aboard, so he held on to the side. One of the men recognized him and reached down to help steady him. Much of his body remained in the freezing water. Sometime later, another lifeboat came alongside. This time, Charles was pulled to safety. When the rescue ship Carpathia arrived later that morning and took the survivors aboard, Charles was examined. Amazingly, he had escaped with only swollen feet.
Can you tell me your name?
No severe frostbite and no life-threatening hypothermia. So how did he survive? The truth is, no one knows for certain. For years, many people repeated the story that the alcohol he drank saved his life. It certainly makes for a dramatic headline, but modern medical experts generally agree that alcohol usually increases heat loss from the body, making hypothermia more likely and not less. So while Charles himself admitted he had been drinking, it's unlikely that the alcohol was the reason he survived. Some researchers believe that several factors may have worked in his favor. He remained unusually calm. He didn't waste energy fighting the water. He entered the sea in a relatively controlled way. And it's possible that a combination of factors rather than one single miracle gave him a better chance than most. But no one can say for certain. Sometimes history keeps its secrets. After the disaster, Charles returned to England and gave evidence at the official inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic. He later moved to the United States, where he continued working at sea for many years before retiring. He never tried to profit from his story. He simply carried on with his life. But more than a century later, his actions that night continue to inspire people around the world. When faced with one of the history's greatest disasters, he didn't think about just saving himself first. He made sure the lifeboats had food. He helped women and children get to safety. He threw dozens of deck chairs into the ocean, hoping they might help complete strangers survive. Only after doing everything he could for others did he fight for his own life. What a brave soul, a real hero. Perhaps that's the real reason we remember Charles Joughin. not because he survived, but because of the kind of person he was. The Titanic has become one of the most famous tragedies, but hidden within that tragedy are stories of ordinary people who showed extraordinary courage. Charles was one of them. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more unbelievable true stories from history, I'd love for you to stay around and subscribe and join me on this journey every week. We will uncover remarkable events, incredible people, and astonishing moments that really happened. I'm Devorah, and I can't wait to share the next story with you. Oh, and remember, this wasn't a legend, and it wasn't a movie. It really happened. Bye-bye.